ago, I delivered a presentation to about 100 educators, giving them my take on why it's important to read. And I was asked to share that presentation more broadly. So this is a few ideas about why it's so important to read. When I asked the educators in the room why they thought it was important to read, a lot of their answers lined up with responses I saw on Google. Actually, I just Googled why read, and these were some of the things that came up most commonly: to develop your verbal and written abilities, to expose yourself to new things, to improve focus and concentration, to improve imagination, to reduce stress, to be entertained, to figure out how to do something, to gain experience from other people, to develop empathy, to understand the past, and self-improvement. And any one of those reasons is a good reason to read. I'm going to offer a few others, my own take on this, some of which will align with this, but from a bit of a different perspective. So before I go very far, I should offer a bit of a caveat and position myself, because I am not an educator, although my specialization, I would say, is in adaptive learning. I'm interested not just in how individuals learn, but also how organizations learn, communities learn, societies learn, and actually how we learn as a species. And also how and why we fail to learn. Why we don't learn from history, why we continue to pursue really maladaptive paths that do harm to us, both as humans and harm to our environment. So this is sort of the bigger picture that I'm coming from. And one of the reasons that I have a focus on adaptive learning is that I think that each of these issues has a root cause, and that root cause is learning. That the problems that we face are the outcome of our learning as individuals and societies, of the way that we've been programmed to think, care, act, and structure our responsibilities. So we are what we've learned to be, and we care about what we've learned to care about, and we do what we've learned to do. So when we see instances of violence or injustice or discrimination, or even instances of people who can't seem to develop the foresight to think beyond their own lifetime, even when they have kids, we often don't think beyond our own lifetime. These are all products of how we've been shaped, programmed to think and care and learn and act. And when I say learning, I'm not talking simply about schooling, although schooling is an important learning system. But I see schooling as a subset of education. And I draw on this definition that was developed by my friend and colleague Ken Lowe, who says that education is everything a society does to equip its members to manage the most significant threats and opportunities of their time and place in history. So it's much broader than schooling, although schooling is terribly important. But there are other learning systems that are shaping us. As educators, you would know that a family is a huge learning system that shapes us so significantly. Communities are learning systems. Organizations, social institutions, economic systems, media, prisons, faith-based organizations, so those are all examples of learning systems. So if we want to understand why we keep having the outcomes that we do, the types of social issues that we do, we have to understand something about the inputs, the learning systems that are creating those. So my take on why read really comes from the perspective of trying to understand how to develop more adaptive individuals, families, communities, societies. So it is big picture, and I know that sometimes we can feel like things that are so big are not part of our responsibilities, but the problem is, whose responsibility is this? We have to individually take responsibility for shaping our social cultural environments, and reading has a big part of that. So as I'm going through my 5 reasons to read, if they seem big, let that just roll around in your imagination a bit. Think about the implications for you as educators, but also think about the implications for you personally as human beings. So the first reason that I would offer is that reading helps to support adaptive learning. Otto von Bismarck said, "Fools learn from experience. I prefer to learn from the experience of others." And we'd all be wise to learn from the experience of others. We don't have to make all the mistakes ourselves. But we don't actually do that all that well. And it's important to understand why. Why don't we learn well from history? I mean, sometimes history is not written in a way that it does draw out the most adaptive lessons to be learned. But even in cases where I think it is, such as the two examples I have on the screen, Collapse by Jared Diamond and A Short History of Progress by Ronald Wright, we don't invest ourselves enough in understanding those patterns, and not just understanding the patterns which we're seeing replicated today, but figuring out how to build that into our social cultural institutions. Ronald Wright notes that many of the great ruins that grace the deserts and jungles of the earth are monuments to progress traps, the headstones of civilizations which fell victim to their own success. In the fates of such societies, once mighty, complex, and brilliant, lie the most instructive lessons for our own. Their ruins are shipwrecks that mark the shoals of progress. Or to use a more modern analogy, they are fallen airliners whose black boxes can tell us what went wrong. I love that analogy of the black boxes, because you think about all that goes into airline investigation, which is something we actually, as humans, do really well. We inquire far more deeply about why airplanes crash than we do about why civilizations crash. And it's not just that we inquire in more disciplined ways, but then the airline industry actually takes those lessons and builds it into their policies, their practices, their procedures, their training mechanisms, their culture, to ensure that those things don't happen again. But we don't have a sort of a parallel for civilizations and for building the adaptive lessons into our cultures. And again, this is the responsibility of everybody. It's not the responsibility of academics or government. It requires all of us to really take this forward. So that's the first reason, to support adaptive learning. The second reason is related, and that's to understand the bigger story in which we're embedded. So this second reason is really about how we can better understand ourselves, and the idea that you can't understand who you are by looking only at yourself, your own story, or the story of your family. You have to understand the bigger story in which you're embedded. Years ago, about 15 years ago now, Stacey Collier, who's the executive director of Calgary Reads, invited me to a breakfast. It was a recruiting breakfast for a program called Leadership Calgary. It's now called Human Venture Leadership, a program that I'm still involved with all these years later. But when I went to this breakfast, I met my friend and colleague Ken Lowe, and he was up addressing the crowd. And one of the things that I distinctly remember from that day is he pulled out a bag of film. And, it was this big tangled heap of film. And he pointed to one of the frames on the film. And he said, "You are this bit of a frame. You're not even a full frame in the bigger human story. You're this portion of a frame. We'd never tried to understand a film by looking at a single frame, but we do that all the time with our lives. We think that we can understand ourselves and who we are as an individual by just looking at our lives or the lives of our family, by just looking at our immediate context or our immediate culture. But the only way to understand ourselves is to understand the broader human story in which we're embedded. And one of the only ways to do that is by accessing the cultural resources available to us that help us to understand that bigger story, including books, documentary films, museums. All of those things help us to understand the bigger human story in which we're embedded. Now, if that seems kind of really big and airy-fairy, I'm going to offer a very specific example of an educator who I think was so successful because she understood this very thing. She understood the patterns associated with the broader human story, and she drew on those to help educate the imaginations of her students. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Erin Gruelle, who was a teacher in the early 90s. But her story will help to illustrate the third reason that I think reading is important, and that is really connected to that idea of authoring your own life. So many of us end up just following the scripts that have been created for us. We don't actually author our own lives, and we don't know how to do that well. But in the same way that that you can learn how to write well by reading widely, you can learn how to author your own life more effectively by reading more broadly in terms of the human story. And that was one of the insights that I think supported her work with a group of students in the early 90s. So she was fresh out of teaching college. It was her first 2 years of practice, and she was given classes of quite vulnerable youth, most of whom were not expected to graduate. There were a lot of kids who'd come in on disciplinary transfers and that sort of thing. Some of them weren't even expected to make it to their 18th birthdays. They were so entrenched in gang warfare and violence that was really divided around ethnocultural lines, that there were huge tensions even within the classroom. And I think there were three things that Erin Gruelle understood that made her so successful with this group, because this group went on to not only graduate, but a majority of them went on to post-secondary school in some form or another, and it was considered kind of miraculous that she had turned their lives around. So she had three sort of insights that I think were really critical. The first was that to be a good teacher, you have to be a good learner. She knew going into this that she did not understand, that she needed to learn something about these young people, about their challenges and what they were facing and what was important to them. And secondly, I don't think she would have drawn on the same definition of education that I used earlier about helping people to meet the most significant challenges of their time and place in history. And coming in, she learned that their most significant challenges were really how to live in what was essentially an undeclared war zone. These kids were facing such tribal tensions and violence. And so I think, she had sort of two tasks. One was to help them to manage life in a war zone. The second was to create the conditions for peace. And the third insight that she had is that these kids were basically following the scripts that they'd inherited, that they were not the authors of their own lives. So she created a project whereby they were invited to write their own stories, which is not an uncommon thing to do in education. But where I think she had remarkable insight was around connecting them to the broader human story so that they could more effectively author their own lives and understand the options available to them, that they were not trapped by the scripts that they'd been given. So she did this by recognizing that what they were experiencing was not unique to them, as much as it might feel unique to them, that this was part of the broader human story, that these were patterns that we see over and over again. So she connected them to all kinds of resources related to that, found books that were written by teenagers who were also living with tribal tension and strife, and how they managed that. She took them to the Museum of Tolerance in LA. They fundraised and invited the woman who had hidden Anne Frank and her family, and had her come, and that photo there is is actually from the film, although it's the actual woman. But the young gentleman who's accompanying her, it's quite a moving part of the film. They've made a film of this with Hilary Swank called Freedom Riders. So I encourage you to take a look at that. The transformation in these young people in terms of how they understood their own stories and what was possible and what was available to them was remarkable. So reading, connecting to that bigger story, is a way of helping us to better author our own lives, to understand what it means to be a good human being and how to do it well in really difficult circumstances. The fourth reason that I would offer is to create options. So I have an image of MacGyver here. I don't know how many of you would even remember that series. I actually never watched it when I was younger, but my image of MacGyver is somebody who always could create the options that would lead to solutions. And the reason he was able to do that was because of the learning he'd done to that point. We as adults tend to really focus on just-in-time learning, and we don't take into consideration the ongoing anticipatory learning that we need to be doing to be able to bring anything meaningful to a situation. So you think about when we talk about reading and meaning making, the meaning that a young person can make of the text they're reading. We understand the importance of background knowledge, that the degree to which that young person can make sense of that text is it's not just about phonics or word recognition. It's also about background knowledge that they're bringing to make meaning of that text. And the same is true of life. The more background knowledge that we can bring to any particular situation, the better meaning we're able to make of it. A term that I came across relatively recently is the adjacent possible. And the adjacent possible is a term that's used to describe the idea that certain developments have to happen in order for certain other developments to happen. So when a development happens, it's like opening a door. And when you open that door that was previously closed, all of a sudden you're in a room with so many more doors, and then other things become possible when you open those doors that weren't possible until you stepped into that room. And it helps to explain an idea that academics sometimes refer to as multiples. So why is it that, at basically the exact same time, in different parts of the world, different people invented the exact same thing? So calculus was invented by two people, different times, at the same time, in different places, with no knowledge of one another. The telephone, radio, there are all kinds of things that were developed simultaneously. You think, why does that happen? And why was it not invented, 100 years before? It's because of this idea of the adjacent possible, that until certain doors were opened, until there were certain developments, other developments could not happen. Once those doors were opened, then that was possible for multiple players. Well, reading can do the same thing. Reading can open up new learning pathways, creating a broader range of options and lower path dependencies. We come to a situation with far greater understanding, and then that creates more options for what we can do. And I think that's exactly what happened in the case of Aaron Gruelle. You think about how other educators might have entered that room and thought about their job and what should be done and what would be most helpful in this situation, and they would have come up with something very different. In fact, years ago when I looked at a Wikipedia entry for Aaron Gruelle, it's since changed, but I noticed that it said that her methods were not replicable. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, if by replicable you mean that they could be laid out in a series of steps, get your kids to read Anne Frank's diary, take them to the Museum of Tolerance, of course they're not replicable. To replicate what happened there, you would have to learn in the way that Aaron Gruelle did. You'd have to be able to draw on all of the background knowledge that she had, and then it would be replicable. You would be able to enter the situation and understand what was possible and what was most important to do in that situation. So the idea of creating options, the adjacent possible, is the fourth reason for reading. And the last reason is because knowledge is a really important responsibility, and we sometimes don't think about that very far. So this book by Douglas Purpura, How Holocausts Happen, is, I think, one of the best articulations for me of why read and of the importance of knowledge, as understanding that knowledge is a responsibility. He examines the U.S.'s involvement in Central America in the late 70s into the 80s. And the fact that the U.S. government was funding, training and supporting militia in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. And tens of thousands of non-combatants were killed during this time. Grandparents and children and journalists and nuns and priests. 70,000 people in El Salvador, 70,000 in Guatemala, and tens of thousands in Nicaragua. And his question is, why were there no protests? Why did people in the U.S. not, there were isolated, small protests, but why did people not rise up and say this is wrong? He said, I could understand in Germany why you might be reluctant to oppose the Nazis. But here there was nothing at stake. It's not like you would lose your job, you'd lose your family, your life would be threatened. So why did people not come forward? And he said, or he concluded that basically it's that people didn't know. And this is the part that I think is important to draw from this book. He says, many Americans, of course, will say, we did not know. That is our shame, as it was the shame of Germany before us. It is our duty to know. After the Holocaust, knowledge itself must become our responsibility. Most people are not used to considering knowledge a responsibility. When it comes to responsibility, we tend to focus on our actions, not on what is inside our heads. Our morality is centered more on our actions than our knowledge. That must change, for knowledge, too, is an act. And he goes on to say that most of us think of knowledge as something we acquire passively, as something that just pours into us. So for that reason, we sometimes don't think of it as our own responsibility. We think it's the responsibility of educators or government or, whoever is supposed to, media, whoever's supposed to be pouring this knowledge into us. But ultimately, he says, knowledge is too important to outsource to others. It is a personal responsibility. So that's my final reason for reading, and those are the five. If you're interested in learning more about this or have questions, you're welcome to check out the Human Venture Leadership website and programs where many of this material is discussed.